The stone walls were always wet. In the underground cells of Europe's witch prisons, moisture ran like sweat down the cracks, dripping into bowls where women were forced to drink the same water that had soaked their chains. The air was thick with mildew and whispers, the kind that came not from spirits, but from the half-conscious moans of the accused. They called them witches, but most had never seen a spell book, never spoken to a demon, never even uttered a curse. Their only sin was being different, too outspoken, too intelligent, too poor, too unfortunate to be loved by the right people. Once accused, there was no escape inside those prisons. Faith and cruelty became one. Priests came not to comfort, but to cleanse. Torturers came not for confession, but for proof, a mark on the skin, a twitch under questioning, a scream mistaken for Satan's laugh. Many of these prisons were hidden beneath monasteries and castles, places meant for God's work. The accused were lowered by rope into cells so small they could neither stand upright nor lie down fully. Some were left chained in the same position for days. The iron bit into their wrists until blood mixed with rust. The interrogators called it purification. Each morning, a priest would enter with holy water and a question: "Do you renounce the devil?" If the woman said yes, they asked her to name others. If she said no, the torture continued. The worst began when they believed her body held a demon that needed to be driven out. Exorcism, the word alone, was enough to send shivers through the accused. It wasn't prayer. It was war. Stripped naked to expose the devil's marks, women were tied to wooden frames. Their limbs stretched so tight that joints cracked under the strain. The priest would chant as water was poured over their faces, not to drown them, but to cleanse them. They called it the holy flood, though it was nothing more than suffocation disguised as salvation. Others were forced to swallow burning herbs or boiling oil, mixtures said to purge evil from within. Those who fainted were revived with whips or freezing water. Those who begged for mercy were told their screams were proof of possession. And through it all, the priest wrote everything down, resisted prayer, cried out when the demon was spoken of, confessed when the iron touched the feet. Their pain became scripture. In some witch prisons, the walls themselves bore the marks of despair, nails scratched into stone, words in Latin and broken prayers etched with bones or bits of metal. Many of these carvings remain today, faint but visible, silent witnesses to agony that outlive its victims. But the torture didn't end with pain. It was psychological too, deliberate, methodical. The accused were often placed in darkness for days, hearing only the sounds of others being interrogated, the cries, the chanting, the dragging of chains through corridors. Each sound a promise of what awaited them. When the cell door finally opened, they couldn't tell if it was daylight or judgment. Some were told they had been possessed for so long that they no longer belonged to God, that their souls had already been traded. The words shattered them faster than any whip. One account from Wurzburg tells of a woman named Margaretha, accused after her husband's illness. She was chained for 7 days in a kneeling position, forced to pray until her voice broke. When she confessed, they made her repeat her false crimes in front of the townspeople before she was led to the stake. Her confession read, "I have spoken with no devil but my own fear." But fear was enough. The witch prisons were never about proof. They were about control, about silencing anything that challenged the power of the church, the crown, or the men who ruled both. Each exorcism was theater. Faith turned into spectacle, suffering transformed into a sermon. And yet, for all their talk of demons, the true darkness was human. By the 1600s, these prisons filled faster than they could empty. Torture chambers ran day and night, the smell of burned wax and blood mingling with incense. Officials boasted of purging their lands of witches, but behind closed doors, many of those same men bribed executioners to keep their own families untouched. In a world ruled by fear, accusation was power, and women, especially the poor, the widowed, the lonely, were the easiest to destroy. But even in the depths of these dungeons, there were moments of quiet resistance. Some women refused to speak, others prayed not for deliverance, but for death, And a brave, haunting few, laughed. Their laughter terrified their captors more than any curse, because it was the sound of someone who had already lost everything, who could no longer be broken. In one surviving letter smuggled from a witch cell in Bamberg, a woman wrote, "They have taken my body, but not my truth. If I die, let it be with eyes open, for theirs are still closed." Her name was never recorded. By the time dawn fell on those prisons, many of their captives were no longer human in the eyes of the church. They were evidence, offerings, warnings. Each scream became part of a greater silence, a silence that spread across centuries, shaping how women were seen, believed, and punished. And though the stones of those prisons are cold now, they still remember. They remember the prayers spoken between gasps, the chains pulled against, the hands that trembled while searching for God in the dark. Those cells were meant to break women, but what they created instead was a legacy that refuses to die. Proof that cruelty can wear the mask of righteousness and that even the name of faith can be twisted into a weapon. The story didn't end when the fires went out. The belief that pain can purify still lingers. Reshaped, renamed, but not gone. The witch prisons may have crumbled, but their ghosts live on wherever power still demands silence. The dawn that crept through the cracks of the witch prisons was pale and colorless, like the eyes of the women who survived another night. Their voices were gone, scraped raw by screams that had no audience left to hear them. In that silence, faith and despair became the same thing. The priests said they were saving souls, but in truth, the Inquisition's dungeons were built to erase them. Every confession wrung from pain was another proof of victory for the church, not over evil, but over fear itself. Some of these witch cells were so small that a prisoner could barely kneel. The walls were slick, the air too thin. Inquisitors called them the chambers of reflection. They believed that in darkness, the accused would see their sins. But what they saw was nothing, only their breath, faint and white, dissolving into the void. The most terrifying part wasn't always the torture. It was the waiting. Women were kept half-starved, given water that smelled of mold. Their chains clanked with every movement, echoing like slow clocks counting down the hours to the next interrogation. They didn't know if the door would open with bread or with fire. And then came the exorcisms. The holy men who performed them often prepared with fasting and prayer, believing that only purity could drive out demons. But the tools they carried into those cells were anything but holy. Iron pincers, cords, sharp needles to test the skin for witch marks. If the woman didn't bleed, they said her body had been sealed by Satan. If she did bleed, it was proof the devil was angry. Either way, guilt was assured. Some victims were bound to benches, cloth stuffed in their mouths, and water poured until their bellies swelled painfully. This wasn't to kill, not immediately, but to simulate drowning. The tormentors would stop just before death, whispering prayers into their ears as if saving them was an act of grace. This method was called the toka, and for many, it was the end of faith itself. Others faced fire, not the kind that burned at the stake, but slow fire, candles placed beneath the soles of the feet or under the palms, the skin bubbling as they were ordered to repeat the Lord's Prayer without error. If they stuttered, it meant the devil still held their tongue. There are records of priests breaking down during these rituals, trembling, crying as they tried to convince themselves that pain was holy. But the church left no room for mercy. To question the system was to join the condemned. And so they continued. By the 17th century, witch prisons across Europe became factories of fear. The more a woman confessed, the more witches were named. Families turned on each other. Children testified against mothers. Communities emptied under the weight of accusation. In Germany alone, more than 25,000 people were executed for witchcraft. Most of them women. Many began their final days in those same underground cells, stripped of identity and humanity. But not all died nameless. In the Swiss town of Glarus, Anna Geldy, often called the last witch of Europe, was accused of poisoning her employer's child. She was tortured with the iron spider, metal claws raking her flesh until she confessed. Historians now agree she was innocent, executed not for sorcery but for defying her social place. Her story marked the end of an era, yet it carried the echo of centuries of women punished for speaking, for thinking, for existing beyond control. The witch prisons may have closed, but their memory is carved into Europe's stones. You can still visit the remnants, narrow corridors beneath Bamberg, Trier, and Würzburg, where rusted rings hang from the walls, and visitors swear they can still smell the smoke. But what haunts most isn't the ghosts. It's the realization that the logic of those prisons, silence, obedience, submission, never fully vanished. It simply evolved. Every time a woman was called hysterical for telling the truth, every time a voice was silenced in the name of order or faith, the shadow of the witch cell stirred again. The women of those dungeons didn't die to be forgotten. They died because they were heard, and that frightened the world. Today, their stories resurface not to horrify, but to remind. That cruelty often hides behind virtue. That righteousness can bleed like sin. And that silence, once enforced by iron and fire, can still be demanded in quieter, subtler ways. History doesn't erase pain. It buries it. But the soil always shifts. And when it does, the voices beneath it rise again, whispering through time that the price of fear is always truth. Remember them, the women who faced darkness and called it by its name. Remember that the line between faith and cruelty is thinner than iron. If you think this belongs only to the past, look closer. The instruments may have changed, but the hands that hold them haven't. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe these stories must never be buried again. Because silence, then and now, has always been the real executioner.